Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Crystal. I appreciate that wonderful introduction. I do think we have someone in the waiting.
Is it perfect?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Everybody can hear me okay? You want to give me a thumbs up? Yes, I see some nods. Okay, perfect. All right, guys. And you guys see the PowerPoint taking control of debt. You see my picture and company logo? Yes? Okay, perfect. All right, guys. So again, my name is Matthew Wilco. I am a registered financial planner. I'm one of the partners of the Legacy Group. I encourage you guys to do a Google search for us and check out our website. We're based out of Syosset as well as Hauppauge. And today's class, or financial education seminar, is about taking control of debt. And we're going to talk about debt in a few different ways. We're going to talk about if you are in debt, some ways that we can or some paths that folks take to get out of debt. We're going to differentiate good kinds of debt versus bad kinds of debt. And then we're also going to talk about moving forward, right? Once you kind of have a debt plan in place, where do you go from there, and kind of how do you begin your financial life and have your take your financial life kind of take off from there. So I got this little clicker here. Let's see if this works. And actually, before I go to the next slide, I would just encourage you guys. I know it's Zoom. I know, nobody wants to take themselves off mute and ask questions in Zoom. But guys, by all means, feel free to please unmute yourselves. I would love for this to be interactive. I would love for you guys to ask questions. If I say something or you see something on the screen that doesn't make sense, please do not be bashful in saying and asking me to explain that or whatever the case may be. If you can't take yourself off mute, we have the chat box, so don't hesitate to type a question in there, and Crystal will be happy to read it off, and I can address it. Feel free to interrupt at any time to ask questions, and at the end, I'm also going to finish with any questions. Okay. Just to reiterate one item that Crystal mentioned, she did provide a link in the chat box to a survey form. If you click that link, it's literally a 4-question survey. I would encourage you guys to please multiple choice, fill that out at the end of the seminar. It is incredibly useful feedback for myself and my partners to make sure that these classes that we do to the community are impactful to you guys. So we really would appreciate you filling that out. All right, so nope, not working. Can you hit the next slide for me? Okay, perfect. Yeah, now it's working. Okay. All right. So just a quick disclaimer. What we're going to talk about today as it relates to debt, this is a very high level overview. It doesn't necessarily mean that the strategies that we talk about today are necessarily what's best for your unique situation. Right. So please don't take this as any kind of gospel that this is facts or legal advice. It's always best to check with your advisors before implementing any changes. All right, so let's first talk about financial well-being, because at the end of the day, when we're talking about debt, it's directly correlated to your financial well-being. And let's take a moment to kind of define what is financial well-being. What does that mean? All right, so the first item is really in having control over your day-to-day and month-to-month finances. So this essentially means that, I like to kind of say that you're ahead of your bills, you're not behind your bills, right? You're in a situation where hopefully you're not living paycheck to paycheck. You have control over your finances, and you're living somewhat stress-free, knowing that you have control over what's coming in and what's going out. And you also have your finger on the pulse. You know what's coming in and you know what's going out, right? The second item there is having the capacity to absorb a financial shock. This is critical, and it's one of the most common reasons why people fall into debt, is that they don't have an emergency fund. And inevitably, when the car breaks down or the roof starts leaking, or God forbid, something more severe, like you get sick, you get hurt, you lose employment, something along those lines happens, without an emergency fund, you're more likely than not going into debt. So it's critical to make sure that the proper planning is in place beforehand, so that inevitably, when life throws you a curveball, it's not going to strike you out. Third item, being on track to meet financial goals. This is really just comes down to having a plan with your financial life. We all have different financial goals, whether it be to retire one day, whether it be to pay for college for our children, whether it be to buy a home, whatever the case may be. Being able to define what your goals are, have a timeline behind when you want to achieve those goals, and then have a tracking mechanism in place to make sure you're pacing well for whatever your goals are. We consider that a strong part of being in a financially well spot. And the last piece is having the financial freedom to make choices that allow one to enjoy life. I don't think anybody here tonight is a billionaire and could just decide to spend money willy-nilly and do whatever they'd like. We all have, money for all of us is somewhat finite, right? But being in a financial well-being position, and with this last bullet point, the way that we interpret that is that, you're able to do the things that you enjoy in life within reason, right? It doesn't mean that you can just, fly down to the Caribbean whenever you want and go on an extravagant vacation, but it does mean that, hey, if it's Friday night and you don't feel like cooking, you can go out to eat, right? If that's important to you, or whatever those little things are, making sure that you can buy Christmas presents for kids or nieces or nephews or grandkids when it comes to the holidays. Whatever it is for you, you're able to enjoy those little pleasures in life, and it's not putting you in a position where you're like, holy smokes, I can't afford to do this because I have all this debt. Go to the next slide. Okay. All right. So let's talk a little bit. Now let's jump into debt, right? So first off, if anybody here today is in debt, you shouldn't feel bad about yourself, because it's really the norm when it comes to Americans, right? So these are some statistics that were published in the last 2 years from 2020, as you see in the bottom. The average American has right now almost $7,000 in credit card debt, right? The average auto loan for the average American is a little bit under $30,000, and the average American is carrying a little bit less than $60,000 in student loan debt. So, the first thing I would say is that, there's nothing to be ashamed of if you're in debt. Most Americans are in debt. And, just developing a plan is really the most important piece. Yeah, it's funny, it works and sometimes it doesn't work. All right, so let's jump into the agenda of what we're going to talk about for the next 45 to 50 minutes, right? So the first thing that we want to address is understanding your debt, right? Second thing we want to talk about is classifying your debt, right? There is such thing as good debt and bad debt. And so we're going to take some time to talk about, well, why is good debt good and why is bad debt bad, right? Step 3 is to create a debt payment plan. Where do you begin? How does it work? What variables do you need to take into consideration when building out your own plan? And then the last is balancing debt and your financial goals. I've been doing financial planning for a little while now, and one of the common patterns I've seen with a lot of folks is that when they look at finance, they look at it in very black and white terms, right? I should do, this is good and this is bad. I should do 100% of this and 0% of that. And more often than not in every case, but more often than not, financial planning comes down to trying to encompass a lot of things and having a diverse mix. It doesn't mean that this is good and this is bad, right? It doesn't mean I should do this or that. How do I do both, this and that, right? And how does this relate to debt, right? Does it mean that I should focus 100% of my effort and capital towards paying down debt and not funding any other financial goals that I have? Or is it better for me to try to find a diverse mix of how do I accomplish both of those simultaneously? We're going to talk and we're going to analyze a case study to kind of show you, well, which one is better and which one is worse. All right. So first thing we're going to talk about is understanding your debt. And this really comes down to understanding what is the true cost of debt. So what you see there on the left is with a $2,000 purchase, right? So you go and buy a flat screen TV, for $2,000 and you throw it on a credit card, right? What is that actually going to cost you by the time you're done paying it? Well, assuming that your credit card has a minimum payment of $50 a month, and assuming that your credit card is charging you a 15% interest rate or APR, which is actually pretty low. Most credit cards are somewhere between 20 to 27%. Right? It's going to take you 4.5 years to pay that purchase off with those minimum payments. And by the time you pay it off in 4.5 years, you're going to have spent $3,100. That's a 60%, close to a 60% markup from the original purchase price. That is essentially just profit for the credit card company. right? So, before swiping the card or before making a decision to take on debt, it's critical to understand, well, what is this truly going to cost me in the end, right? Right, and to continue this idea of understanding your debt, there's a few variables that we want folks to look at, right? The first is what we just spoke about here, is to be very clear about your interest rate. Obviously, a 3% interest rate is a lot better than a 15%, and a 15% is a lot better than a 25%, right? And that kind of goes back to what we're going to talk about in a little bit of good debt versus bad debt. Debt that has a very low interest rate, obviously that's going to be looked at in a much more favorable light than debt that carries very high interest rate, right? But it doesn't stop there. The second item that you see on the screen is to know if that interest rate is fixed or variable. Right? A lot of you might remember back in 2008, there was a real estate crisis in our country. There was a financial meltdown. And a lot of it can be kind of traced back to that mortgages that were being granted during that time period were variable mortgages, meaning that you take out the mortgage today, it's a 3% interest rate, but over the 3 to 5 years into that mortgage, it's going to jump to a 5, 6, 7, or 10% interest rate. So your mortgage just went from $2,000 a month to $2,500 or $3,000, right? Not to say that all variable interest rates are bad, but it's something that you need to really carefully take a look at, because there's risk involved in that. When you take on that debt, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for you to forecast out to say, here's how much this is going to cost me in the end, because you don't have control over what's going to happen with that interest rate. So it doesn't mean it's bad, but it is something that needs to be taken into consideration, and know that if you are going to jump into something that has a variable rate, you are taking more risk on. All right, the third item is to calculate the true cost of your debt. That's what we did in the last example. Kind of know by the time I'm done paying this off, what is this really going to cost me? And then lastly, knowing the terms of your debt, right? One of the biggest things here is sometimes when you take on certain loans, they come with prepayment penalties, meaning that if you do want to pay it off early, you're actually going to be penalized for doing that, right? Not all debt works that way, but some does. So knowing that along with other fine print is really important before jumping into anything. All right, so here we're going to get into classifying your debt, and we're going to get into good debt versus bad debt, right? So I'm going to start with good debt. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is actually what you see in the middle there. I'm going to talk about mortgages, because I think this is the most common example that you hear out there in the world, right? So mortgages are typically looked at as a good form of debt. And I think the easiest way for me to illustrate this for you guys is kind of think of it this way. Debt that is going to add wealth for you and your family typically is good. Debt that is not going to add wealth for you and your family is typically not so good, right? So how does a mortgage play into that? Well, if I buy a $500,000 home today and I take out a mortgage because I don't have $500,000 in cash, like most people don't, right? And 20 years from now, that $500,000 home is now worth $1 million, right? Well, I've just created $500,000 of additional wealth for myself and my family. So I use the power of debt, the power of leverage to build more wealth for me and my family, right? Not to mention that mortgages, there's tax benefits with mortgages, right? The interest that you pay to the bank in a mortgage is tax deductible. So the simplest way to think about that is it saves you money on taxes in the here and now, right? So it adds wealth, right? There's tax benefits. So mortgages generally are looked at as a good thing, right? Education is what you see on the top, right? This gets a little tricky because I'm sure we all have friends or family members or know stories of people that went to college and got themselves into tremendous debt and got a degree that unfortunately is not helping them find employment, right? So in that situation, it may not be the best, but typically and statistically speaking, most folks that go to, that pay for higher education, college, typically make more money, have higher incomes over the course of their 30, 40-year working career than folks that don't. So the idea here is that if I'm taking debt on, and that debt is going to allow me to make more money over a very long period of time, and by making more money, I'm going to be able to save more and invest more, which is going to build more wealth for me and my family, right? Generally speaking, that is a good thing, right? So that's why you see education on there. And then the last thing you see is your business. So the idea is if anybody here tonight is a business owner and you're taking loans out to help fund your business, purchase equipment, vehicles, whatever the case may be, that's typically looked at as a good thing, because that's an investment that by buying that additional vehicle or equipment or what have you, it's going to generate more revenue for you as the business owner, which more revenue means more income. And that means more that you can save, invest, and build more wealth. So everything you see on the left, good debt, essentially it comes down to this is putting you and your family in a position where by taking this debt on, you're going to be able to build more wealth, and that's a good thing, right? On the right-hand side, you're going to see bad debt, right? So this is all items that typically are not going to create wealth for you and your family, right? Credit cards are listed there because most things that people buy with credit cards are not things that are building wealth. Typically, it's, you know, it's discretionary items, right? Luxury items, typically. Furthermore, even if it's not a luxury item, right? Credit cards typically have very high interest rates. And if you have a really high interest rate, like 15, 20, or 25%, really essentially, you know, you're just giving your wealth over to the credit card company, right? So they're typically not looked at as favorable debt. Costly vacations are on there. You know, there's ways that we can all go on vacation in an affordable way, and then there's ways that we can go that maybe aren't affordable for our situations, right? Kind of knowing what you can afford, being in tune with your finances, like I said in the beginning of the class here tonight, and knowing what you can afford and can't afford, and stretching and pushing too much and really taking on a vacation that's outside of your means. And certainly if you're taking on debt to help finance that vacation, typically is looked at as maybe not one of the best decisions, right? And then the last one is impulse purchases, right? Go on to the next slide. I think there's someone in the meeting room, so no problem. All right, so now moving into the next topic here is to classify your debt, right? So what are the common variables that are looked at when we talk about classifying debt? Well, one of the top ones is interest rates, right? If you have a higher interest rate versus a lower interest rate, obviously it's going to be in your better interest to pay off the higher interest rate one first, right? Looking at the total balance that you have is also important. Looking at what's the minimum payment is also very important. Analyzing which debt is helping you build credit, right, which is a good thing, versus which debt is not helping you build credit is another factor that we need to look at. And then going back to the slide, you know, the slide that we did before, does it fall into the good debt column or does it fall into the bad debt column? So classifying all these things and getting a better understanding of, you know, is my debt good? Is it bad? Where am I at? Is really, really important. Go to the next. Okay. All right. So creating a debt payment plan, right? It without, you know, there's that old saying, right? You know, not planning is planning to fail kind of situation. You know, if you find yourself that you're in debt and you don't have a plan on how to get out of debt, certainly doesn't mean that you're not going to get to the other side one day. But typically, if you do have a plan, you're gonna end up in a better position. You're gonna get out of debt quicker, right? And the four main reasons why are by putting a plan in place, you're essentially taking control of the situation, right? It could be very overwhelming when there's no plan. How are we going to do this? I don't see how this is going to work. But by putting a plan in place, you kind of gain control of the situation. You take it in bite-sized pieces, and now it becomes more manageable, right? The other item is that you build momentum with a plan, right? There's another old saying, you know, success breeds more success, right? Bodies in motion stay in motion, right? So as you have a debt payment plan, and as you start going through that plan, you're going to see that it's going to start working. And when you see that success that you're having, it's going to reinvigorate, you know, you to kind of double down and build momentum and kind of get through the other, accelerate you through to get to the other side, right? Third item, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, is making sure that we're striking a balance between paying down our debt and our other financial goals, right? Does it make sense for us to put 100% of our effort and focus on paying down the debt, and once that's paid off, then starting funding our other financial goals like retirement and college planning and what have you? Maybe, but in most cases it doesn't. In most cases, it's better to pay down the debt, and also at the same time still have a balance where you're still allocating cash flow and capital towards your other goals. And we're going to talk more about why that's the case in a little bit. And then the last piece, by having a plan in place and knowing and analyzing it and saying, okay, over the next 4 years or 10 years or whatever the situation is, I'm going to pay off this debt. And as long as I stick to this plan, 4 years from now or 10 years from now, I'm going to be debt free, right? That allows you to see light at the end of the tunnel. And that is incredibly impactful to, keep your spirits high, which is important in making sure that you stick with the plan. Because if your spirit is not high and if you're not feeling positive about the situation, it's going to be really hard for you to stick with it over the long term. All right, and guys, just once again, by all means, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to type it into the chat box or take yourself off mute. Anything that you see here that doesn't make sense or you have a question, don't hesitate. All right, so let's talk more about creating a debt payment plan. So one of the first things that we want to look at is working within your budget. So typically, and again, right, not every situation is different. This is, trying to paint everything with a very broad stroke. But in most cases, you don't want to allocate more than 20% of your overall household budget towards debt repayment, right? As soon as you start crossing that threshold of more than 20%, you might be stretching yourself a little thin, right? So that's one of the benchmarks that you want to look at. Right. Another benchmark is tackling one debt at a time, right? When one debt is eliminated, moving on to the next one, right? If you have multiple credit cards or multiple different lines of debt, kind of taking it one at a time, knocking that one down, and going on to the next one is also really impactful in creating a debt plan. Right? Developing a timeline and sticking to it. Include every debt, payment amount, due date, and projected end date, right? I can't stress how important it is when putting a plan in place, seeing, hey, if this plan works in this amount of time, I'm going to be debt free. Right? And essentially what this slide is showing here, that when you have a debt payment plan, right, and this is kind of showing, 4 different loans, right? When one loan gets paid off, so for example, if you're allocating $500 a month towards debt repayment, and the first loan is $100 a month of that $500, well, once that falls off, right, you've now freed up $100 of cash flow that you can allocate towards, paying down the other loans more aggressively, right? So in that debt payment plan, you can kind of see, okay, well, over the next, hypothetically, over the next 12 months, this loan will fall off, which will now allow me to accelerate the payments on the other 3 loans, which means that over the next 12 months, the second one will fall off, and so on and so forth. And then balance debt and other financial goals, right? So take advantage of compound growth and future income. Compound growth, or compound earnings as it's typically called. Warren Buffett, who's, if you haven't heard of Warren Buffett, he's one of the most successful investors in the world. I think he's the 3rd or 4th richest man in the world. He's got, I want to say, something to the tune of $80 to $100 billion. It's constantly fluctuating. And he grew up in Nebraska in like the 40s, came from grew up on a farm kind of situation, didn't inherit any of the wealth, and became one of the richest people in the world. There's a very famous quote of his from, I think, I want to say 20 to 30 years ago, where he called compound growth the 8th wonder of the world. And essentially what compound growth means, that when you have an investment, and let's just say that investment is yielding a 10% annual rate of return. Well, in year 1, you have 10%. And then in year 2, you have your original principal that you invested, plus the earnings from last year, the interest from last year. So you're gaining, you get 10% on the former 10% interest you earned last year, right? And that may not seem very impactful, but mathematically, when you zoom out and you look at this over a period of 15, 20, 30 years, right? It compounds, and you find yourself in a situation where the wealth that you're building really accelerates. And towards the end of that 20 to 30 year period, it really just starts skyrocketing, right? There's another famous story that they teach to high school kids and college students in business, where they say, it's a hypothetical. But it's saying, many years ago in medieval times, two farmers are called in front of the king, and the king basically says to each farmer, I can give you one kernel of rice, right? I can give you one kernel of rice today, and then the next day I'll give you two, and then the third day I'll give you four, and then 8, then 16, then 32, then 64, 128. Basically, every single day I'll double the amount of rice that I give you. But we're talking about single, kernels of rice here, and I'll do that for 30 days. Or I'll give you 10,000 pounds of rice immediately right now. Which do you want? And farmer 1 says, I'm going to take the 10,000 pounds. What, are you kidding me? I'll take that right now. Farmer 2 says, you know what? I'm going to take the one kernel today and then double that every day for the next 30 days. And who do you think 30 days from now has more rice, right? I forget what the exact calculation is, but by the end of the 30 days, farmer number 2 literally has billions of pounds of rice. I think it's like the entire world supply of rice farmer 2 essentially owns. And that just shows the power of compounding, that when you're doubling and when you're growing at that rate, as the numbers start getting higher over time, it really picks up steam really fast. So why am I talking about this? Well, we're gonna go on the next slide and you'll see why. All right. So balancing debt and financial goals. What this is essentially showing is that if instead of funding 100% of your efforts towards debt or funding 100% of your efforts towards saving and investing, if you do a combination of the both, right, what kind of position does that put you in, right? Where you start accumulating some savings, right, while you're also paying down debt, right? And this kind of gets into it in a little bit more specific. So with person A, right, they're going to pay $200 a month towards debt. That's their free cash flow. They can allocate $200 a month, right? So where are they going to be? And once the debt is paid off, right, at that time they're going to start saving, right? And what you see is that it takes them 6 years to pay off the debt at $200 a month. And then as soon as the debt's paid off, they immediately take that $200 of cash flow and start funding it into an investment, which is yielding a 10% rate of return, is what the assumption is here. And in year 7, they have $2,400. So I think most people look at this and they say, not bad, not a bad plan. But there might be a better way, right? And that's what you see here with person B. Person B takes 107, of that $200, they allocate 175 towards debt repayment, but then they take $25, don't allocate it towards the debt repayment, and start saving it into that account that is giving them a 10% interest rate. Right? Where are they going to be 7 years from now? Well, 7 years from now, as you can see, the debt is paid off and they have $3,130. So from a perspective of building wealth, person B, took a different strategy that now put them in a position where they and their family have more wealth than person A. And the main reason for this is because with person B, by putting that $25 into that account that's earning a 10% interest rate over time, that they're starting to achieve compound interest. If we forecasted out another 10 years from here to see in year 17 or year 27, you'll see that person B is going to end up with significantly more wealth than person A. All right. So let's talk a little bit more, getting back to kind of a debt plan. Right, so putting your plan into action, right? So one of the most important things to do is to kind of just reflect how you got into debt, right? How did you land in this situation? As human beings, we all have patterns and behaviors that we exhibit, and a lot of times people that fall into debt, a lot of times it's through no fault of their own, and in other times it could be because some of their decisions, right? So kind of reflecting, well, how did I get into this position? And what can I maybe do different next time is important to make sure that you don't end up in the same position, 5-10 years from now. Right? Changing bad spending habits. If I can't really afford this, right? I don't really need this. Do I really need to buy this? Or is there a more cost-effective way that I can purchase this? Taking a look at that and making sure that, if you do have some bad spending habits, really looking at that and trying to figure out a way to correct it is important. Right? I think this goes without saying, right? If you're in the process of paying down debt and you're working on formulating a debt repayment plan, taking on any new debt really should be something that you really look very hard at before taking that on, right? Because obviously that essentially is not really going to help get you out of the hole, right? Renegotiating where you can, right? There's another very famous adage that says, ask and you may receive, right? Clients of mine that, have credit card debt or have debt with various lenders, I always tell them there is nothing wrong with you calling that credit card company or calling whoever's holding that loan and just asking them, hey, is there anything we can do to try to renegotiate the terms of this? Is there anything that you can do to help me try to pay this back quicker or in a more affordable way? And you'd be shocked. you would be really shocked at a lot of times what these companies are willing to do. It doesn't always work, but it's worth asking the question. Right? Build your credit history and manage your credit score. And then making sure you save, right? Balance is the key to financial well-being, which is really what we covered in the last few slides, right? Allocating 100% of your focus towards just paying down the debt and then starting to save towards your other financial goals may not always be the best way to get you to where you want to be over a long period of time. So, I always tell clients when it comes to any form of financial planning, whether we're talking about debt or we're talking about investing or whatever it is that we're talking about, diversity is usually one of the most important things. And having diversity in, allocating cash flow towards debt versus other savings goals is very important. And that balance usually is going to put you in a better position. Right? And that's the presentation that I have for you folks this evening, right? So, once again, my name is Matthew Wilco. I'm one of the partners of the Legacy Group. We're based out of Syosset. We have another office in Hauppauge. Just a reminder, in the chat box, you'll see there's a link there. That link is going to take you to a Microsoft page where there's just a 4-question survey. I would please ask all of you, if you don't mind, clicking that link and filling out the survey. We want to hear from you to make sure that these classes that we're giving to the community are impactful. And if there's anything we can do to improve, we want to hear it. And if we did a really good job with certain things, we want to make sure that you tell us that too, so we know to keep doing it. All right. At this time, I'm going to open it up to any questions. So by all means, please take yourself off mute or type something into the chat box, and I'd be happy to address.
Which credit card companies are more willing to renegotiate than others?
So that's a great question, Crystal. So Crystal asked, do I know of certain credit card companies that are more willing to negotiate as opposed to others? So the short answer is I don't, and I don't think there's any specific science behind that, right? I think a lot of it comes down to, the person that you get on the phone. I think a lot of it comes down to, what kind of position that company is in. If that company's doing much better, typically upper management puts less pressure on people, that are in the trenches to be more stringent and not working with people, as opposed to a company that's doing a little better, where maybe they're, they have a little bit more discretion. So there's so many factors at play that involve whether or not that company is going to work with you. The key there is to really just ask and not only ask once, but there's nothing wrong with calling back again and maybe getting somebody different on the line and asking the same question.
Someone in the chat wants to know how much your private services are.
So my private services, that's a great question. I would encourage you, if you, in that survey that I ask everyone to fill out at the very bottom, it does state that if you're interested in talking about your personal financial situation, to just input your contact information, and then someone from my team will reach out to schedule a phone call with you. The short answer is that our services really vary depending on the client's situation. I have clients that have tremendous needs, and the fees that are involved with them are going to be higher than clients that have much lower needs. So we're going to charge accordingly. So the process of how we engage with clients really comes down to, first having an initial consultation, which there's no cost for, asking questions, allowing me to ask some questions about your situation, your income, your different assets that you may have or may not have. And then from there, I quickly quote clients and say, if we want to take this further and develop a relationship, this is how we would engage, and here are the costs there. So I apologize, I don't have a straightforward answer to that question right now, but that is something I can give you a straightforward answer to if we were to talk one-on-one.
You also said during your presentation about when you save the $25, putting it somewhere that gets 10% interest. Where can I go? That's going to give me 10%.
Well, interest rates are on the rise. So, everybody hears about interest rates rising, and you hear a lot about how that negatively impacts us. And there are certainly negative impacts to interest rates rising. But there's, and I tell people, just like anything in life, financial planning is no different. There's pros and cons to everything. And the fact that interest rates are rising means that in savings accounts or high yield savings accounts, CDs, things like that, the interest that we're going to earn in those accounts is on the rise. And as the government continues to raise interest rates, it's expected that those are going to continue to rise as well. Now, does that mean that you're going to open up a savings account tomorrow and get 10% interest? Absolutely not. It's still very low, right? But typically what yields higher returns is things like investments. Investments don't necessarily just mean the stock market. Yes, it means the stock market. It also means real estate. It also means investing in businesses. And if you look at the S&P 500, which for those of you that don't know, the S&P 500 is the 500 largest US companies, right? So you're talking about the Amazons of the world, the Netflixes, the Walmarts, the Verizons, etc. And essentially, if you took 500 of the largest companies and you took their stock prices and you meshed them all together and aggregated them into one single entity, right? That is what the S&P 500 is. And when people say the market is up today or the market is down today, that's typically what they're referring to. They're referring to the S&P 500 because those 500 biggest companies, they take up such a large portion of the stock market that if they're going up, everything else is going up. If they're going down, everything else is going down, right? Take that with a grain of salt. So to answer your question, Crystal, over the long period of time, right? Long period means 10 plus years, the S&P 500 averages a 10% rate of return. And since 2009, it's averaged 15%, right? So is it easy to put your money into something that is going to give you a 10% rate of return? No, it is certainly not easy to do. And typically anything that's going to yield that kind of rate of return is going to come with risk, right? There's no guarantees of that kind of result. And it doesn't mean that you're getting a 10% rate of return consistently every year. There might be years where you get a 20% rate of return, then -10. But when you average it out over a long period of time, it can average out to 10%. So, I would say, in general, the way to think about investing, right? Things that are low risk typically offer lower rates of return. Things that are higher risk offer the potential for higher returns. The biggest key when it comes to investing is time, right? A lot of people will talk and they'll say, they feel like investing is like gambling. And I say, well, here's really the fundamental way that it's different. If I go to a casino and I'm sitting at a table and I'm gambling, the more time that I spend sitting at that table, the odds of me winning are going down, right? The casino wants me to stay there for as long as possible. Investing works the complete opposite, right? The longer I stay invested and stick to the plan and stick to the course of action, the greater my likelihood of success is. So hopefully that gives you some context around that question. All right, really good questions, though, guys. Anybody else have any questions? All right, so just to recap, guys, I think, pillars when it comes to talking about debt is understanding your debt, right? Understanding, is it good debt? Is it bad debt? Putting a plan in place with a timeline to get out of debt, very, very critical. And then, analyzing, your patterns and making sure that whatever got you into this debt in the first place is not something that hopefully you repeat. That, and the final takeaway is making sure that there's balance in your financial life, right? Doesn't always mean that, putting 100% of your focus on paying down debt is the way to go. Sometimes trying to figure out a way to do as much as possible and continue saving for your other goals is important as well, right?
I have one other question.
Oh, please, Crystal, one other question, no problem.
With student, oh, here's another in the chat. Is it a good idea to consolidate your credit card debt in the long run?
So that's an excellent question, right? And just like anything else that I'm talking about, just like the disclaimer I said in the beginning, I'll say again, anything that I'm saying tonight, we're talking about it from a very high level, right? So don't take it as specific advice for your situation. This is speaking in general terms, what works for most people, but everybody's situation is a little different, which is why, you need to tailor your approach to your specific needs. So to answer your question, is it a good idea to consolidate your credit cards? Generally speaking, yes. Generally speaking, by consolidating your credit cards, what you're essentially doing is you are putting a debt repayment plan in place by doing that, right? You're putting a plan in place, you're consolidating things, you're formulating a timeline and cash flow on how much you need to pay over this amount of time to get out of debt. So consolidating it generally is a good idea, but again, every situation is different. And that's why, we need to take a look at it and see if it makes sense for you. So hopefully that gives you some answers, lady.
A lot of times when they do the balance transfer offers and stuff, they're like, oh, there's a 5% or a 3% transaction fee.
Yes.
So like they don't often do where there's like no fees anymore to do that.
Yes.
So like then you really have to compare like what that is going to cost you compared to keeping it as what it is, right? Like how easy is that to do?
Yeah. It's, and one of the most helpful tools is if you just Google debt calculator, one of the top things that are going to come up is a simple calculator, like 3 websites you click on and it could just enter, all right, here's what my principal is, here's my interest rate, here's my minimum payment. You plug those numbers in, you click go, and it can give you the answers to, okay, here's how long it's going to take you to pay it off. Here's how much money you're going to spend on interest versus spending down on your principal. That's really one of the first steps to understanding your debt, right? Realizing the situation that you're in. And that's going to help in making those decisions. Like Crystal just mentioned, does it make sense for me to consolidate? Does it make sense for me to switch from this card to that card if they're going to charge me a transaction fee to do it? These are all things that you need to kind of take into consideration before jumping into any decisions.
And the student loan debt, I know now they're like talking about forgiving some of it, and there's all this like legislation, but like other than just working with your lender to do either income-based repayment or whatever, there's no like, how else do people chip away at their like educational debt?
Education, I mean, so, educational debt is very unique, right? Because there is a lot of chatter in the government about trying to do things to help folks. I kind of wish that was around when I was paying off my student loans, but there's a lot of chatter of that. So that is kind of putting a lot of folks in a confusing spot of like, hey, do I allocate additional resources to paying this down if there might be some aid that's coming to me at some point in the future, right? Unfortunately, since nobody knows what's going to happen, it's very difficult, right? And what we typically try to encourage clients to look at is until something is written into law, it's very hard to formulate a plan around it, right? So more often than not, you kind of got to formulate your plan based on the existing environment. And if the environment does change and the laws do change, then at that time we can reevaluate things. And that doesn't always guarantee that you're going to end up in the best position. Sometimes you might kind of go back and say, I wish I did it a little differently, but it's impossible to know what's going to happen in the future. And we gotta kind of work best with what we got. That being said, student loan debt is also very interesting because there are tax benefits, right? The government does give you tax benefits to paying down your student loan debt. So that's why analyzing and defining your debt is so critical. What's the interest rate on it, right? How much debt do you have, right? Is consolidating it, the right move, right? Even with interest rates on the rise right now, they're still low compared to where they were 5 years ago, right? Compared to where they were, historically. We're still in a low interest rate environment from historical standards. So is consolidating that debt a good idea right now? These are all things that need to be taken into consideration as you try to formulate a debt plan, right? And there's so many variables in play that there isn't a blanket answer to say it's always good to do this or it's never a good idea to do that. It really depends on your situation. It also depends on, well, what are your other financial goals, right? If you're, if you're later in life and there's a goal to retire and you haven't started saving for retirement, does it make sense to start paying down student loan debt at an aggressive rate at the cost of not funding your retirement? Or does it make sense to not pay it down at an aggressive rate and allocate that cash flow to retirement? That's something that needs to be looked at and analyzed. So it depends on your income. It depends on the debt itself. It depends on what your goals are, where you are in life, what your expenses are. These are all things that need to be looked at before making a decision. So hopefully that not a yes or no answer, but hopefully it at least provides some context on what needs to be analyzed to try to land on an answer of what's right for you.
And then to sum up, you said it's best to pay off debt that has the highest interest rate and then go down to what's the largest balance.
So typically, right, if you have very high interest rate debt, typically trying to, and again, I stress the word typically because every situation is different, but in the majority of cases, trying to get that debt and assuming it's bad debt, right? Assuming it's not good debt, it's bad debt. Trying to get that paid off first is usually the best way to go about it. Because even if you have something that has a higher balance, but it has a lower interest rate, you might end up over a long period of time giving less money to the bank, paying this one off at the normal rate as opposed to this one, right? Because even though it's got a smaller balance, if that interest rate is significantly higher, you're going to end up, you could potentially end up, forfeiting a lot of your wealth to the bank as by not paying that one off at a more aggressive rate. So, it's got to be looked at. Every situation is different, but in most cases, if you have something that has a significantly higher rate, you typically want to kind of focus on that one first.
Is a car loan considered good debt?
So a car loan is not considered good debt, right? Again, very, very simple way to think about good debt versus bad debt. Good debt typically is helping you build wealth, right? I buy a house, that house is going to appreciate in value. It's going to add more wealth, right? I pay for education. That education is going to allow me to have a career that I can most likely make a higher income. And that's going to allow me to build more wealth, right? Cars are not assets. Cars are liabilities. I buy a car today for $40,000 and 5 years from now, it's worth $7,000, right? That did not help me build more wealth. So we all need vehicles, right? I'm not sitting here saying don't buy a car, right? We all need cars. We all need to get around. But typically a car loan is not considered good debt. Now, what also needs to be considered with car loans is a lot of times car loans offer very low interest rates, right? So while it's not considered good debt, if it has a very low interest rate, then it may not be something that you want to pay down at an aggressive rate. The school of thought there is that if I have a car loan that's paying me 3%, and I could take that money and invest it, and over a long period of time, earn a higher rate of return by investing it, averaging a 6% or 8% or 10% rate of return over a long period of time. Well, I would rather put my money in something that's earning 6 to 10% as opposed to something that's earning 3%, right? So these are all things that need to be kind of considered. To give you a short answer though, lady, car loan is not considered good debt, but taking a look at the interest rate is important to helping you decide, is it something that you want to try to pay down at a faster clip or just kind of making the minimum payments. Oh, I'm very happy to hear that, lady. Thank you for that feedback. Phil, if you can fill out one of the forms, that would be even better. So guys, I really appreciate all the time that you put into this evening. If you have any questions at all, my contact information is there. That's my direct line. That's my email address. You can go on our website, legacygroupny.com. Please fill out one of the survey forms, and if you'd like, you can put your information there, and someone from my team will contact you if you want us to talk and help you through your personal situation. And I thank you for all of your time and all of your effort, and I thank you for all the questions at the end. It really is what makes these classes and presentations impactful, is when people ask questions that are interactive. So I appreciate all of that at the end. And I look forward to hopefully having the opportunity to connect with some of you afterwards.